my name is Liz Folger. I'll be presenting on Chapter 9, which is discussing the behaviors and interactions of members within groups within an organization. So to start off with, let's discuss the interpersonal nature of groups within organizations. There are four potential outcomes of interpersonal behaviors within groups. The first potential outcome is need satisfaction. For example, certain members of groups could have their need for affiliation satisfied within that group. Not all need satisfaction is the same for each member. Each member has unique needs, and certain groups meet certain needs for certain members. A second potential outcome of interpersonal behavior within groups is social support. For example, if an employee at work is going through a rough period at work, let's say the boss really was hard on him recently, he was reprimanded strongly, a group can provide social support to that employee by coming up alongside him during that hard time at work and provide encouragement. Just be that social support that the employee needs at that time. And that is one potential positive outcome of group behavior. A third positive potential outcome of interpersonal behaviors is synergy. In essence, if a group has synergy, that means that, or what that translates out to mean is that groups whose members encourage and support one another typically are more effective and more efficient for the organization than groups whose members do not encourage and support each other. So synergy is definitely a positive outcome of interpersonal or interaction behavior, and it's definitely an outcome that organizations should strive for. One final outcome of interpersonal behaviors that is most often seen as negative is conflict. Unfortunately, conflict is a natural part of our lives. It exists in every context in this world. It's unavoidable. Therefore, it would stand to reason that if conflict is unavoidable in life in general, it will most likely happen anytime you get a group of humans together and ask them to interact with each other. As a result of interacting with each other and with other group members, certain group members could end up disliking or disagreeing with other members of the group. That is a chance that you always have to take whenever you form a group, and that is a risk that the group leader needs to be aware of and needs to be ready to take care of should conflict arise within the group. Let's go ahead and move on to the second portion of the presentation, which is discussing types of groups that can exist within an organization. The reason we want to discuss the types of groups that can exist within organizations is because types of groups differ depending on the social situation. For example, types of groups that exist in a church setting will differ from groups that exist in a school setting, which will differ from groups that exist in an organizational setting. And since we're discussing organizational communication, it stands to reason that we want to discuss types of groups that exist in the organization. There are two types of groups that can exist in an organization. Groups can either be formal, which means that the organization itself formed the group, or a group could be informal, where the group members themselves formed the group. There are three types of formal groups that can exist. The first type is a command group, and essentially this group is pretty permanent, just very functional. This command group is your typical type of group that you would see walking into any organization. These command groups are pretty standard in any organization across the board. A second type of formal group is a task group. These groups are formal but typically pretty temporary. These groups are formed to accomplish a certain goal, and once that goal is accomplished, there's really no need for the group to remain a group, so they typically disband, not because they don't like each other, but because they were formed to reach a goal, they met the goal, there's no need for the group anymore. So they're very temporary. A third type of formal group is an affinity group. These groups don't necessarily have an organizational purpose per se. However, within an affinity group, peers generally meet regularly with each other and they share information with each other, organizational information with each other, and they also help problem solve with each other. Moving on to the second type of group that can exist in an organization, there are two types of informal groups that can exist. The first type of informal group is called a friendship group. Typically, these friendship groups are relatively permanent, very informal, and they really do exist purely for the social benefit of the members. The second type of informal group is called an interest group. These interest groups are typically pretty temporary, still informal. Interest groups are typically formed around a common activity, a shared interest, or shared idea. Moving on to the next part of the presentation, we're going to talk about the stages of group development. There are 4 stages in the development of a group. The first step is called mutual acceptance. Generally, during the mutual acceptance phase or stage of developing a group members are typically just introducing themselves, really getting to know the other group members pretty much on a surface level. This is not getting really into deep beliefs or ideas. It's really just surface level interactions among the group members. The second stage in group development is communication and decision making. Typically in this phase of group development, members begin to be more open and begin to dig deeper into each other's beliefs, ideas, their feelings. And in addition, typically the group's goal is firmly established, and also the group begins to assign group roles to the members during the communication and decision making phase. The third phase of group development is motivation and productivity. This is really the stage where the rubber meets the road. This is where the group is getting stuff done. The group members are cooperating, they're helping each other, they're really working to accomplish those tasks that they've set out to accomplish their goal. The fourth stage of group development is control and organization. During this phase, the group has progressed typically to become a mature group. They're operating. They really don't need a lot of structure, a lot of rules to function as a group and to function effectively. They're a mature group at this point. Moving on to the next part of the presentation, we'll discuss some group performance factors. There are 4 group performance factors that we'll discuss in this part. The first factor is composition, group composition. There are 2 types of compositions that can exist in a group. The first type of composition is homogeneous. A group with a homogeneous composition typically means that the group members are very similar in ways that are important to the group. In other words, ideas, viewpoints, worldviews, not necessarily favorite TV shows, but the group members agree with each other on matters that are important and that are relevant to the group. Conversely, groups with heterogeneous compositions typically means that the group members are different in ways that are important to the group. That could be age, seniority, viewpoint, political views, any number of ways that are relevant to the group. Typically, these group members differ from each other. One composition isn't necessarily better or more effective than the other. It just depends on the context of the group and also the group members, also the group's goal for determining which of these types of compositions is most effective for accomplishing the group's goal. A second performance factor is the group size. We don't really need to go into a lot of detail with this one. Obviously, the number of members in a group affects the performance of the group. A third performance factor for groups is norms. Norms are the standards for judging appropriate behavior. Typically, these group norms are developed by the group members themselves. These norms come out of the individual group members' behaviors, personalities, things like that. So the norms are developed within the group itself. The fourth factor that we'll discuss for group performance is cohesiveness. Cohesiveness is the level of commitment that group members have to staying in the group. typically, the more cohesive a group is, the more effective the group is for the organization. However, that cannot be a universal statement, because just because a group has a high level of cohesion does not necessarily mean that there is high organizational usefulness from that group for the organization. For example, groups that suffer from groupthink are typically very, very cohesive. All the members are very committed to the group, but they're so committed to being committed to the group that they fail to consider alternative options, and as a result are usually very ineffective for an organization that they exist in. Going into that, we'll go ahead and discuss the last part of the presentation, which is group decision making in organizations. There are 4 topics that I want to discuss in this last part of the presentation. The first topic I want to discuss is group polarization. The book defines group polarization as the tendency for a group's average post-discussion attitudes to be more extreme than its average pre-discussion attitudes. Kind of going off of that, as we already discussed, groupthink, the book defines groupthink as a mode of thinking that occurs when members of a group are deeply involved in a cohesive in-group, and the desire for unanimity offsets their motivation to appraise alternative courses of action. Obviously, groupthink is not a desirable characteristic for a group. It typically makes a group very highly ineffective. Typically, the members do not benefit from being in a group that suffers from groupthink. And there are 8 symptoms of groupthink that groups suffering from groupthink often display. 8 symptoms. Those symptoms are illusion of invulnerability, collective efforts by the members to rationalize or discount warnings, unquestioned belief in the group's inherent morality by its members, members stereotyping their views of the enemy's leaders, the group putting direct pressure on a member who disagrees with the other members of the group, self-censorship of deviations from group consensus, a shared illusion of unanimity, and finally, an emergence of self-appointed mind guards. To kind of explain what a mind guard would be, going back to the symptom of putting direct pressure on a member who disagrees with the consensus of the group, someone who would be a quote-unquote self-appointed mind guard would most likely be the one to confront the disagreeing group member and put him in his place, as it were. Make sure he doesn't go against the grain of the group, and make sure that he goes along with the flow of the general consensus of the group. Obviously, groupthink is not desirable. All groups should work in any way possible to prevent groupthink, and there are 2 ways that groups can work to prevent groupthink from occurring within their group. The first way to prevent groupthink is through group participation. Typically, what happens in groups is the more vocal, outgoing members typically speak up all the time, and those group members that are more shy, more hesitant to speak, typically sit in silence and just go along with what the more outspoken members of the group think. The second way to help prevent groupthink is through group problem solving. The book mentions 3 ideas for group problem solving. I won't necessarily go into all 3 of these in depth, but the 3 techniques for brainstorming that the book mentions or for problem solving that the group mentions are brainstorming, nominal group technique, and the Delphi technique. Each of these problem solving techniques are effective in their own way and in their own contexts. Again, one is not necessarily better than the other. It just depends on the type of group, the group's goals, and also the group's members. That concludes my presentation on Chapter 9. I hope you all enjoyed learning about Chapter 9 as much as I enjoyed reading about it. I hope you all have a great rest of your semester, and I hope you have a great night.